All right, Rich, let's light this candle. We are on air live at the first of 100 Gauntlet cons. We are talking Delving Dungeons, the OSR, and I am here with some fine minds on the subject. Jason Hobbs, Maria Rivera, and myself, Slade Stoller. We're going to figure out what this is all about. We'll probably solve it, really. We'll get it all figured, everything defined. You can walk away and game for the rest of your life, no more questions. But first question, just following on my screen here, we'll go Jason and then Maria and then myself. Jason, how long have you been gaming? Where are you gaming now? What other gaming-related activities are you doing? Tell us a bit about yourself.
All right, so I'm Jason Hobbs. Probably the biggest game-related activity that I'm known for is the host of Hobbs and Friends of the OSR. It's a podcast, an RPG podcast, basically about the OSR and me talking to people and maybe covering different topics. The Hex Talk series is pretty popular, so that's something. As long as how long I've been gaming, I started gaming in 1978 with the Holmes D&D edition with some of my older cousins in my aunt and uncle's basement. So that was a long time ago. I'd say that game, was really just a bunch of different D&D editions that we just all played together. So now I mostly game online, I would say. I do some convention gaming, the OSR conventions like North Texas and GaryCon. And then I'm probably next year going to go to Origins and meet up with a bunch of the other Misdirected Mark podcast guys I'm pretty excited about. And I always play at Gamehole Con also in Madison. So what about you, Maria?
I started gaming in mid-2000s. I was in middle school, and I just got interested through some gaming group in Spain. My first game was Aquelarre, actually, an earlier edition in Spanish, actually. And then I played a bunch of games after that. And here I am now.
Great. Yeah, Aquilar, is that getting an English translation soon?
Hopefully.
I feel like I've heard that it needs to be and hasn't been.
It's been kickstarted. It's just delayed for different reasons. Rest in peace to our wig.
Oh, I see. All right, and I guess that leaves me.
That's right.
I've been gaming in classrooms that were not being used and in basements since probably the 90s. Started out with a lot of the typical 90s stuff, Vampire and D&D, AD&D 2nd edition. And where am I gaming now? I'm gaming with the Gauntlet mostly. I've got a small bit of in real life gaming going, but yeah, most of my gaming is with the Gauntlet. And other activities, I'm trying to start this publishing venture called Scablands Press, get it off the ground. We've got a few games that they're all right. They work.
And I've hacked one of them, so.
And Maria has been hacking and doing a great job at that. And that ties into Codex, so it's all kind of a big mix of Gauntlet stuff. So let's get into the meat of this issue here, defining the OSR. We've got a quick question here from Philip. What makes a dungeon? Oh, well, let's just do that. Let's start right there. I think we called the gaming space that we had the dungeon. The parents definitely did. We were down in the dungeon and dragoning. But maybe I'll throw that over to Jason. What is a dungeon?
Well, in the early editions of Dungeons and Dragons, that was the only place that they really even talked about. There was never any game that happened outside of the dungeon. It only happened, in some kind of subterranean maze that monsters had some crazy Gygaxian naturalism that they survived by. So what do you think, Maria?
That's True, but I think that that definition has changed over the years. Like now, dungeons might be more complex than just an actual dungeon or a maze.
But if we go back to those old modules,
Yeah,
things like Keep on the Borderlands, Temple of Elemental Evil, these kind of things, there was a city, and that was your happy spot. And you could refill. And then there was the dungeon. You travel out, you go underground, and a whole bunch of monsters that probably shouldn't be together, but somehow are, come and try to kill you. I think that was
yeah.
my experience of it in my basement days. But
In the
that
early
makes
days, oh, sorry. I would say that's totally true. I was just talking about then. I thought we'd go longer. I'd say now when you talk about hex crawling, all that really is a dungeon with 6 sides instead of 4. So, and even past that, if you talk about space games, I mean, in a lot of games, it's just a 3-dimensional dungeon, really, when you're traveling around in space. So, hypothetically, it could be anything, really.
so that kind of confused me. I mean, the 6-sided dungeon I love as a concept because we're so dungeonified in our heads. But I want to play something like Traveler, and someone throws down a hex grid of spaces. As someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with Traveler, I'm going, how do we get the 3D element in that?
I don't think you normally do. I think that has to be, creative, part of the theater of the mind aspect of the game. But I've heard people say, that like the planets are the cities, and then the space is the dungeon that you can create different things from. So, I mean, I can't say that I really ran a whole bunch of spacefaring type games. I definitely believe they're part of the OSR, though. So I guess that all makes sense in this particular panel. So,
I
what do you
mean,
think, Maria? Yeah.
I mean, stars without number is a thing technically. So yeah, that's part of the OSR. And yeah, like think I think the dungeon is very loosely defined, and I can totally see the dungeon being. So here's a question: how strictly defined would you say the dungeon is? Would it be, or like the each individual dungeon, not the dungeon as a concept? Like for example, the dungeons in Temple of Elemental Evil are defined by the module, but let's say the dungeons in whatever other thing you're doing, like for example, this let's say the space dungeon. Uh, how would you run a sandbox basically? I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear.
I love
Please,
that
think so.
question.
yeah,
I think so. I mean, the sandbox would just be larger, right? It could
yeah,
be a sector, like in Stars Without Number. Kevin Crawford pretty much says how to make a complete sector, which is a total sandbox. Basically, you do the same things that you would in your little barony, if that's where your sandbox normally is. You decide where things are located. You probably make some random tables, if you were in my mind, about what you could run into when you're traveling around in space in that sector. And you could make some safe areas on different planets, multiple ones, or maybe like in an asteroid belt or anything else. That's kind of why I said that it's the same concept, at least, or philosophy, when you're making a space setting sandbox as it is when you're making a wilderness setting sandbox. It's just 3-dimensional as opposed to a hex. I mean, in all honesty, a hex crawl is 3-dimensional too, right? I mean, you go down in the ground, you could go up to a floating castle. I mean, there's just creativity is the limit to what you can really do. So,
I think that's a good point that was made. I don't know if it was episode 2 or 3 of Hex Talk, but that in a dungeon like Maria's saying, Temple of Elemental Evil, for example, you know where the rooms are, but you don't know where the monsters are, maybe. But on the other hand, if you've got this big, wide, sandboxy location, maybe you don't even know where the location is. So you've now got sort of a wandering location, a poorly defined location. You have to go hunting for it in a region and maybe roll to even encounter the entrance to the temple that goes down. And that was an idea that I thought that was really interesting.
one of my favorite products that I think is one of the best hex tools around, and talk about it kind of on my show, is Treasure Vaults of Zadaban. And like some of the main areas are named in there, but there's like 3 or 4 created dungeons that don't have a static location. Those aren't found until you end up rolling them on the random tables. So there's an actual living example of them. So I also should mention that Eric Hoffman and Jose, my buddies, are harassing me right now on Hangouts until Eric gave me crap because that was his line that they hex crawls a 6-sided dungeon. So
can't take credit for that one then.
Nope.
So
we got another question.
Yeah, we've got a question here. Edwin is asking, how do you create a feeling of peril?
That's a really good question, actually.
Who's going to start?
I'll throw my hat into the ring here. I create a feeling of peril in kind of a metagame way. If my players do something that's noisy, I'm like, can you roll a d6 for me? And then I just go, okay. I feel like it's kind of gaming the system. It's kind of playing with that boundary between gaming and not gaming. But I feel like when I do that more, they're less likely to fart around, explore every single tiny detail. I do that to kind of remind them, there are monsters roaming around, and they may eventually find you. Oh, and leaving dead things lying around, showing that whatever is in here has slaughtered things way more powerful than you. There's a warrior with a shattered sword, and he's got some pretty nice looking armor, and in his pack there's some pretty nice items and quite a bit of gold, more than you've got, kind of thing. I think those would probably be my 2 ways to do it, if I'm running like dungeon delvey type games. What do you think?
I would say that peril isn't necessarily something you're going to be able to do unless you're, physically telling your players you're going to harm them. But tension is something that we can create, and I think that what you said is a good way to do that. Basically, holding them responsible for their actions within the dungeon, be it kill things and leave them laying around so people can find them, making noise. Any actions that the PCs make could create reactions, and knowing that, I think will add a area of tension to it. Just the random encounter every 6 turns in a lot of the OSR games around, you're supposed to rest, and then who knows what happens while we're resting. Just the fact of making random rolls, or like, that's obviously as soon as the dice get rolled, then people have realized that the stakes have changed. So that's going to add tension to the game too. Maria, you got anything?
Nothing else other than, what was already established, like basically react to the players appropriately, and it also depends on the whatever you're running. For example, if there's a time constraint, make sure that they know that the time constraint is there.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you talking like in a metagame way, or in a kind of within the game, or
within the game,
within the game?
Like, for example, we have to get this, the dungeon has a medicine that the villagers need, and just remind them at the entrance that, or maybe every so often, that the villagers need the medicine and they will die if you don't give it to them.
Yeah. One of the adventures I'm working on for Z number 2 is called the Sicilian Tubes, which is basically this massive maze-like area that these giant, they're not purple worms, they're giant Sicilians have, not, from Sicily, the worm-like creatures that made all these tubes, but the entrance is actually only available during low tide. So that means that as the tide rises, it's going to be impossible for your characters to get out if they don't get out in time. So not only are you saying, okay, your resources are being used up as time goes on as you're exploring, you also know that in 6 hours, you're not going to be able to get out, and you're going to be stuck down here with whatever happens. So any of those things, like a clock is perfect for that. And I mean, you can do a volcano is starting to erupt in the background, or maybe an earthquake is happening, or you're actually moving along a riverbed and you know that a storm is coming. So eventually water is going to come rushing down it. Any way that you can add tension is going to enhance the game and make it feel more perilous. Previously, I was going to say every game's perilous because your characters are going to die. That's what's going to happen. But in some ways, that doesn't add tension for people because they're like, well, I know he's going to die. I'll just roll up another one. Who cares? But if you do these other things like you're saying, or up with a clock or, dice or whatever, that will maybe just increase that intensity, and so that you could get that feeling from your players.
So it's good that you mentioned players. Actually, Maria, you've been a player of mine. Was I able to create a feeling of peril? And if so, what was I doing right? Because I was trying.
I don't remember which game specifically.
We ran some Dust, Fog, and Glowing Embers a while ago. Oh. You played Frederick.
Oh, right. And then there was an indie hack game. I think the part where my character wasn't really involved, but there was a part where these threads that were tied to a bomb or something.
Oh yeah, we had a very careful bomb disposal happening in the scene beside.
Yes.
Okay.
And that did not go well.
No. I guess maybe then being willing to follow through is a kind of a metagame way of increasing peril. I won't pull any punches. If you set that off, it's gonna be bad. Like Jason was saying, holding them responsible for their choices. Let's quickly jump here to Philip's question. He's asking, are there any dungeon don'ts?
Well, anything that makes your players feel uncomfortable in a non-safe way, I would say would be, but that's for any game really, not just in the dungeon. I think you could get away with almost anything if you present it properly. I don't really have anything off the top of my head. I would say just like no one likes to play in a game where the GM, is just killing them willy-nilly for nothing. I would rather make the player make choices which puts them into the situation as opposed to the GM just making choices. So what do you think?
That's a fair that's a fair point. It also depends on the group, I think. There are some groups that will let you get away with more than others, I think. It depends, but it's true.
I was going to say this is actually a kind of a good segue into one of the things that we were going to talk about, right? In defining the OSR component, when you're saying all of that really kind of goes in line with some of these questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is death a central part? So like, don't pull any punches. Don't let your characters live when they ought to die, quote unquote. Is the GM a godlike figure? Is that something we shouldn't do? Should we fudge dice rolls? Maybe that's too controversial? I don't know if we want to touch that. I would say, yeah. Let's. I'll just quickly say what I was thinking before I forget here about Philip's question. For me, as someone who has very bad visual awareness, I guess, as GMs and players, don't ignore the spatial stuff. There's nothing that breaks my immersion more than having a 10-minute discussion about which room was on the left and which room was on the right, and getting into the nitty-gritty of all of that. That for me is something that you definitely want to avoid. I don't know if other people get lost in dungeons the way that I do, but got to keep everything carefully and straight. And if we walk down this passageway and all of a sudden it's that room, but there wasn't enough space for that, and I lose my mind.
It's about making the stakes clear, right?
Yeah. And, so don't not make things clear. Sorry, don't not make things clear.
Yeah, I was just thinking that kind of goes in line with, are you a proponent of theater of the mind when delving in the dungeons, or would you prefer, some sort of maps and minis type of idea if you're playing together, or if you're online? I mean, do you use maps on, say, a Roll20, or what? I mean, what do you think about that?
I think in a tight corners place like a dungeon or a castle, sure, I can use. I like it. Would be good to have a map. In in hex crawls, definitely. In the case of um, going back to the space dungeon, or just a regular wilderness dungeon, I think Theater of the Mind can also work.
Yeah.
What do you think, Slade?
Yeah. If it is a dungeon, if the point is a dungeon, then I do want a map. If the dungeon is, if what we're focusing on in the dungeon is more interpersonal stuff, or there's this one really big combat, with a few features, I'm not too bothered by not having maps and hashing out, oh no, the pedestal is over there. That wouldn't bug me. But if we are running we're going 6 levels deep to find something, and there's definitely a passageway that goes back out if we can only find it, that's when I kind of, my sort of board game strategic side comes out, and then I want a straight answer as to whether or not this passage goes directly north or 5 degrees northeast. Yeah.
So a lot of people say they don't want to use minis and maps because it wastes time, right? You're using up time messing with that tactile aspect of the game. But I often wonder does it actually take more time to do that? Or do you end up using more time trying to explain where everything is? Or if you actually did use the maps and minis, it would just do it on its own. I don't mean to stump you. I'm just curious.
No, that's a good question. Maria, do you use miniatures?
In cases that miniatures are useful, yes, I use miniatures. And also it depends on online play as well. Like I don't use them as much in online play because, again, the time constraint. And just laziness.
Yeah, there's a certain tactile feel to putting a miniature in a place that I really respect and appreciate. There's also the practicality of having that in an online thing, as you say. I mean, you could use Roll20 and you can play around a bit with Hangouts to draw some maps and screen share them, and I've done a bit of that when I run map intensive games. But what do I prefer? I think I probably prefer Theater of the Mind if I could get away with it. But there's so many mazes where I can't choose. It's too tough. They're both good. They have their place.
Yeah, I will tell you that in the games that I run online, which is the Kalmata game that I talk about on our podcast, I definitely make tons and tons of maps, and I use dynamic lighting for most of that. And I think I'm not going to say the game goes fast because it's usually just someone, we have a good time at the same time, but we only play for 2 hours, and that's the entirety of the session. Usually you go there and you come back, and now you're in your safe place again, or in town at least. And I think it helps. There is some time that's used up by, oh, I don't have the lighting right on this token, or, oh, where's my token? I don't know, where's yours, or whatever. There's some of that happens. But I think in the end, I think more time is saved, and it helps people know. There's the problem with you're trying to simulationist almost a little bit where tokens are and how they're interacting with each other, when combat in most OSR games is very abstract. And so by adding that simulationist thing to it, you may be making it more complicated than it needs to be. In the end, it comes down to personal preference. So you want to answer some more questions here or what?
Yeah, let's hit up Farrell's question. Do you feel that a critical component of the dungeon experience is, quote, weird stuff hidden in weird corners? I'm thinking of the skeleton pond from Sailors of the Starless Sea. So how important is weirdness to the dungeon experience?
Well, with that question, we're talking about Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I would say, which is a game that definitely is inspired by Appendix N and not necessarily Dungeons and Dragons itself. And the Appendix N is weird as it can get in a lot of ways. There's a lot of weirdness in the Appendix N. So if that's what you're trying to run, then I think that it is a critical component. I think most Dungeon Crawl Classics published modules are going to have a lot of weird. I mean, if they're third party or even, if they're from Goodman Games itself. When I run Dungeon Crawl Classics, I think I even try and lean towards the weird more than I would in like a BX game or 5e or anything like that. So what do you guys think?
It definitely depends on what you're running. It's just the weird stuff in the weird corner. I feel like a lot of OSR flavor tends to lean towards weird stuff in weird corner, but it really depends on what you're running, I think.
I love the weird stuff in the weird corner.
Definitely.
I would only do that. I would almost throw out all the NPC stuff. We don't need NPCs. I mean, unless they're really weird. And we probably don't even need monsters. We just need dangerous things that the players can pick up. And then I say, roll a D100. Oh, 76. That's not good. That's, oh boy. Constitution checks all around. So I think part of maybe it's for me, it was years and years of just bashing monsters over the head, but I love just strange objects and strange characters and the statue that rotates and these kind of odd things. I really, it's the only part of it really for me. I'm done with fighting monsters.
I don't know if I would call like rotating statues weird. I'm thinking more along the lines of Lamentations or some of those games are like that, but where if you shift back towards Adventure Conqueror King, like that, I mean, doesn't have a ton of weird in it. I mean, it's just high epic fantasy, really. But where Lamentations or Dungeon Crawl Classics, they edge on what some people would call the gonzo, right? So, but I mean, it has its place in our past for sure. When you're talking about Expedition to the Barrier Peaks or all those crazy modules that had the London ones, the UK modules. But I mean, I don't see a lot of the weird in Village Hamlet or
Sure.
Slave Pits of the Undercity. I mean, I guess it's kind of weird when you think about giant insects moving around taking care of slaves. That's pretty weird, but within the context of that game or that specific module, I'm not sure if most people would call it weird. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like almost more sort of supernaturally type stuff, like crab men whose meat is delicious, and once you've had some, it turns you invisible, and I mean, like combining these sorts of things,
the DIY aspect of OSR, which I kind of feel like the OSR is fragmented, and I'm just hinting at that maybe when I call it the DIY aspect. But when you look at Kyle Chenier's Blood in the Chocolate, now that's a weird module. I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's pretty cool, but it's weird. I mean, it's just a D&D retelling of, Willy Wonka in this chocolate factory. So that's pretty interesting and kind of cool, but definitely very weird. So if you haven't seen that, I would say get it if you get a chance to look at it. And then if you like weird, you should look at that module.
Yeah. So Jason of Gauntlet fame ran that for us with the Indie Hack my game, just to sort of try it out, and we had a blast with that one. Don't touch anything or you'll be vomiting jam, for hours, and we had a lot of fun with that one. We completed it. I think we probably saw about half of what's really in there, but we had a good time.
It's a pretty cool game.
It's a weird one.
Another published product that recently came out is Jacob Hurst Swordfish Isles, and I really wouldn't say it's as weird as I don't consider it that gonzo. It seems like a pretty much, I wouldn't say standard hex crawl, but it's a lot closer to what I would consider more traditional in a adventure or something. I guess I should be dropping a lot of products, but just to, for examples, it seems like interesting. So totally different than Love the Chocolate, I guess, is totally on the opposite side of the spectrum, really.
Yeah. So, should we hit Dylan's question here? Dylan is asking, do you prefer to start in the dungeon, at the dungeon entrance, or have the players find the entrance? Maria, as a player, what do you prefer?
As a player, if it's a one shot, I would like to start at the entrance. Eh, if I'm, or there are some games that might not be as OSR, like Dungeon World, where sometimes starting in the dungeon in medias res is good, but this is OSR. So I would rather start at the entrance itself in a one shot. In terms of a long running campaign, I would like to start at the city actually and get a quest from there, and then go to the dungeon as needed.
Okay, cool. So you're turning the question on its head. Maybe I don't want to go to that dungeon.
Yeah.
Jason, what do you think?
Historically, I would say I mostly play hex crawls. So we usually start in the city, and then we decide we don't even know what dungeon. We may not even go to a dungeon. We may just go wander around somewhere, right? As a player, I can see merit to all of those. If you're playing in a hex crawl where you don't even know where the dungeon is and you have to go to find it, there's fun in that journey. I can't say I've played too many games where I'm starting in the dungeon itself. But I can't say that I play a lot of one-shot dungeon delving games ever, actually.
It might be interesting to actually play a game where you're escaping the dungeon. I know Thomas Novaso was trying to do something like that with Runaway Hirelings, his minigame, where it's the hirelings, all the party is dead and the hirelings are trying to get the treasure and run. So, yeah.
So you guys have given really beautiful, nuanced answers, and I'm going to just pick one. I want you to start at the dungeon entrance, because I think that's the scariest place to be, because you could turn around and not go, but we know you're going to go. And so you want to be able to look around and see, all the places you could be instead, and still decide to go into the dungeon. I'm convinced that's the right answer. No, I think you guys are right. There are merits to each, and flipping it around. Thomas Novacel's Runaway Hirelings. You start in the dungeon. You got to get out. Victor is asking, coming off your comments on making things clear, do you map the dungeon for your players, or do you have them map the dungeon? Oh, this is going to cause a war of ideas. Wow.
Yeah.
I almost want to think on this for a minute. Maria, do you give your players maps, or do you have them map?
I think it depends on how story gaming you want to go, which also ties into whether OSR and story games are strictly separate or they can be intertwined, which I think it's actually the latter. But that's fired. Just my thoughts. So.
Oh, I like it. That's good.
Yeah. Jason?
I'm almost most of the games that I actually play in, I try to map as a player, and even if they're not, then I'll still map anyway, just because I like that. I like doing it, so I still do it.
Oh.
But games
I interpreted the question differently. I thought it meant like mapping the actual dungeon, as in creating the dungeon. I my bad. I thought it was.
I think that's valid. No, I think that's a good. That's a good point too.
Yeah, that is true.
Instead of mapping as in drawing out the dungeon for the in-game aspect. I thought he meant at or they, whoever, meant at a meta level. So both questions are valid. It's just
Yeah, for sure.
I interpreted it the meta level, not the in-game level.
So there isn't the sort of standard practice for a lot of the older stuff for the GM to have their map and just tell the players, this is a 20 by 20 room. It's 15 feet high with a domed ceiling that rises to 30 at the top, and then just let the players decide if they want to try to figure out how big that room is on a piece of paper with some pencils.
That's definitely a valid way of doing it. In person, like I say, I usually, even like at con games or whatever, if we do end up doing something, I usually try to map it. If I'm running a game online, like I say, I use dynamic lighting. So that only allows you to see, the area that your light allows your tokens to go. So if you don't map, then we'll see where you go now. That's how it's going to go. But if you use Fog of War or something, it's already done for you, so it doesn't matter.
So I tend to use Fog of War when I'm running these very complex dungeons, just because it takes a bit of the cognitive burden off the players. I could have them maybe in another tab drawing something, but I don't know if that would... I think that would lead to that problem that I have with spatial stuff, where you think you've gone all the way around in a circle, but you've actually only gone 3/4 or something like that. So how many rights did we take after that? That frog idol? It was 3 or 4, or did we go left? Yeah, that kind of stuff bugs me a little.
In a game, I've actually... Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention that I actually found a secret door because I was mapping, and that's kind of a fun thing. It was Rapping-a-Thuck, I think. And that's kind of a fun thing just to do. I was mapping on my own. I wasn't told to, and I think... I can't remember if you used dynamic lighting or Fog of War, but there's something satisfying. I mean, in a lot of OSR games, most of the time, you're not necessarily playing a role as much as playing yourself anyway inside the characters, because you don't have huge backstories or how far role playing goes. It's obviously up to the individuals, but there's going to be some meta there when you have somebody mapping, right? So, but it's a fun thing to do. I mean, I like it.
I certainly wouldn't stop anyone from mapping.
No, yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think if you're running a game and you see someone actually just starts mapping, you'd be like, oh, that's cool. Even if you're in a wilderness or a star game or anything, if they're just writing down something that helps them know where everything is, that's awesome.
Cool. Will Patterson asks, in Theater of the Mind, do you suggest narrating the twists and turns of the dungeon? You come to a T intersection, do you go left or right? Or do you focus on moving the players from one interesting/important location to another? Okay, so this is getting deeper into the interpretation that Maria had, which I think is pretty awesome.
Yes.
Do you come up with the map on the fly in Theater of the Mind? And if you do you only narrate the highlights? Oh, you've taken a bunch of tunnels and now you're here. What do you think?
I've done it both ways. So I was just going to say, I've done it both ways. Because there's going to be times in a game where people are going to end up somewhere where you don't have a map. So you can make a choice then, you wander around through some crumbly tunnels, it smells, and there's distant shouts echoing along the chambers, and you open up into this room. Or, you have a choice. Do you want to go towards the light over there, or do you want to go through the darkness where the dust has not been changed, or what? Sometimes you might want to make those choices just to give them some more player agency, as opposed to, nope, you're here now, and that's all the choices you had the whole time. So I think I've done it both ways. I probably prefer the mapping thing, but like if you're in a point crawl, that's the way you're doing it anyway, is you're just moving people from one interesting location to another, right? So.
Right, absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, Maria.
Sorry, I'm personally from a less old school background, and also I'm not super descriptive, so I'm personally more I lean mostly towards just moving players to each interesting location. I oftentimes feel like if there's nothing interesting in a room, why am I even here? But that's just me due to my background in not having been playing since the 70s, I guess.
I would say that I usually put something interesting in every room. Otherwise, I agree with you. What's the point?
Yeah.
So.
And then we've got the old modules that go into painstaking detail of every little piece of barrel that's a little bit to the left and it's half full of wine that's stagnant, and if you drink it, there's this problem. And then at the end, and nothing else of note kind of thing. And players will toss the entire room and collect a whole bunch of little trinkets, but nothing too exciting. And I think that's the thing that bugs me a little bit about some of the older stuff, if I try to run it straight, is that there are just objectively boring rooms that get in there. And part of the game, I guess, was or is about figuring out which ones are the interesting ones. And I think I probably have a more similar background to Maria in that I like to skip to the exciting bit and tell my players, there's nothing exciting in here. You can look, there's nothing too exciting in this pile of trash. But then in that one pile of trash, there's this really awesome thing. But then you let them know by telling them that the pile of trash is glowing a little bit, or, you know, like you can signpost it a little bit better and end up not spending so much time collecting copper pieces and, you know, looking for false bottoms in chests and whatnot.
I think that's another. Oh,
sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's another example of how, even though, you know, this is the OSR and we talk about playing games the old school way, we've learned things since that was created. You know, back then when they were telling you how to stock dungeons in the first edition, you know, 90% of them should be empty. Just because that's more realistic. When we're talking about a fantasy elf game, who cares what's more realistic, right? What's more fun? So do whatever is the funnest for you. And I don't think exploring 90% of the room being empty is more fun. So
Indeed. So we're about 3/4 of the way through here, and we've not yet defined what the OSR is. So before we go any further, I feel we should address this. What is the OSR? What does OSR stand for?
Maria?
Oh my God, you're asking me. Even the acronym, I've heard different ways the acronym is interpreted. Like the most common is old school Renaissance. There's also old school revival. I guess it means going back to, in some way, shape or form, going back to the way it's been run in the 70s. I could be completely wrong because I have not been playing since the 70s, as I've established. So I would prefer if Jason defined the OSR than.
Okay, but that's what's out there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's multiple things out there. I would not say that I have the audacity to try and even define what OSR is to anybody. I usually prefer old school Renaissance because I like the idea of taking the feeling of the games that were then and making them new again, or tweaking them in ways that maybe make them better for us, the players or the people that are playing those types of games right now. So that's what I like to call it, because that's really kind of what the Renaissance was. And I think that's, I don't know what it was originally created, how the acronym was originally created to mean. I mean, I'm assuming most people know kind of what it is. It's basically in the 2002 when they released the OGL for 3rd edition, it allowed people, specifically Matt Finch and Stewart, to write a game called Osric, which was a complete copying of the rules of 1st edition. It wasn't even originally done to make a game. It was actually just done to see if they could get away with it. And they did. They weren't sued by WotC, so that opened the doors for all the other games. You know, if they're first wave, if you call it first wave OSR, or if you call it Neo OSR, or whatever it is that you want to call it, that's really where it started, I think. And I don't care if you call it the old school revival or the old school Renaissance. I usually just say OSR. And I do a podcast about this, and I have never attempted to define it on the air. So That's not something I would want to do.
We almost made it through this without defining it, so
Almost.
it's good that we pinned it down. So you're talking about Osric here in the early days. Who's creating OSR stuff? Is this main? And you talked a bit about DIY. Is this mainly a DIY enterprise? Are there big OSR publishers?
I guess I wouldn't say big ones because I mean, who are the big? Is there anything that really Paizo and WotC, I'd assume, and I don't think either of them are necessarily creating OSR, but WotC did consult with some of the more known, a couple known members of the OSR in 5th edition, so they recognize that it exists, and they changed the rule system to be acceptable to people who are more interested in OSR than other types of games. So they may not be publishing it, but they know that it exists. And I think, I mean, if you look at the Ennies, I mean, an OSR product has been in the last few, winning gold. So I guess I'm shifting the topic a little bit of the discussion, but maybe I'll get back to that. I think that there's different groups. You have OSR people who think that 1st edition is the only way to play the game, and that's all they want to play, and that's all they want to create. So that's what they're creating. And then you have other groups, which I would say are more the DIY people who are like Mike Everins' Hubris, which is one of the OSR products that won, or Blood and the Chocolate, because that won, or Lamentations. These are the guys that are creating stuff. I mean, I'm trying to write stuff. My buddy Eric, he writes stuff through Stormlord Publishing that's considered OSR. I think everyone is. This is the golden age of gaming right now. Anybody can be writing anything that they want. And if people want to buy it, they will. If they don't have to. So does that answer the question? I don't know, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. So it's a kind of restriction a bit on the approach to the core rules. Would that be fair to say?
If you're defining OSR as it requires a certain rules system aspect that is similar to the earlier games, which most people do, I think, say that that is part of the definition. That's why games like Dungeon World is by some people not considered OSR, even though it has an OSR feel and they're trying to recreate that. It's not necessarily an OSR game. Like Black Hack is the same thing because they don't use the rules, mechanics, or systems that the old games use. So there is some restriction there, but I think there's also innovation as well. I mean, there were games that were using advantage, disadvantage before WotC took it on, right? So a lot of these rules things were being used, and a lot of them were being made up by OSR publishers. So to say that there's no innovation, I think, would be totally inaccurate, especially if we talk about even going back to the weirdness aspect. I mean, you're not going to see that kind of weirdness from the big publishers because they're going to be as vanilla as possible because they're trying to write products for everybody, not just people like Slade Stolar who like weird stuff. You know?
I only like weird stuff. That's all I'm into. It's got to be weird. Okay, well, that sounds like that maybe plays into the next question is how's the online scene developing alongside this? Because while it's doing something fairly traditionalist, it's also benefiting a lot from things like podcasts, things like online gaming. I mean, if you're running a hex crawl with Fog of War, I mean, that's something that it doesn't feel old school. That feels very new school in terms of technology. So what's the interplay there with the online scene? Fire that to Jason.
Well, I have I think I'm like 1,200 hours on Roll20. And most of the games that I play, I would say are OSR games. So it's happening. I mean, it's out there. If you check, like, Roll20 is what I use. I don't use Fantasy Battlegrounds, but if you check the Roll20, the org group, when they put out, what games are people playing, the large group of it is like 5e or more known games. But I mean, if I'm getting 1,200 hours in, and I can tell you there's almost any time of the day on any day of the week that you could find an OSR game to play on Google Plus, I think that it's got a huge following. Huge is probably bad because it's relative to other. It's not nearly as large as the audience of 5e, although there's some overlap there, right? I'm not saying that everyone uses what I use. When you put dynamic lighting in an event in a dungeon on Roll20 and you're moving around in there, it can add some tension to the game because you just can't see any farther. So I think it is a cool way to use modern technology to enhance the feel of the game, and even to help create that feel that you've been looking for all along. You can create a lot of awesome maps online, and anyone can do it. You don't have to be famous artist or anything like that. Like my buddy Paul Wolf is creating these awesome vector maps right now for his setting that are pretty awesome. And I mean, all we're doing is an inch on that map. An inch by inch is our entire campaign that we've played for 50 sessions, say. So he's just doing it for the love of it, I think. But I think it's fitting great. I'm not sure how it could be better, to be honest. I think if people were doing more like WotC is with they just came out with Tomb of Annihilation, and here's all the tokens already made. Here's all the maps already added into battle maps, and you don't have to do as much as a GM. That's where I think it should be going. I mean, if I was a publisher and I had the wherewithal and the capability of doing it, that's what I would want to do. I would want to make maps. I would want to have the whole thing set up. Just you buy it, and then almost anyone could run it because you're saving people time. And that's really what I think people are buying, right? New ideas and saving themselves time.
So kind of like box sets but online. That's a neat idea. And even in the commercial side, you have things like Drive-Thru RPG with a bunch of OSR stuff. Like, for example, I don't think I would find Lamentations in your friendly local game store as much as you would find it on Drive-Thru.
Yeah, that's true.
So it definitely benefits.
Great point.
So let's take a turn towards the cutting edge. What should well, I'll send this to Jason because Maria and I are sort of more OSR curious than really deep into it. So what's new and exciting in the OSR that people should pick up, other than Blood in the Chocolate, which we've discussed is quite odd and quite interesting?
I really am a big fan of Swordfish Isles, so much so that I contacted the author and told him that we were probably going to do a couple Hex Talk episodes about it, and he sent us some free PDFs for it. Part of the reason for that is he did a player's guide that all the players are supposed to have, and it's basically a diary or a journal of a guy who actually explored this island, and the players are supposed to use that to decide what they want to do or how they want to do it without having that extra, here's the town where the quests are given, or here's the random rumors that you got. You have this whole book that you can just, anything out of it, you can decide, oh, this is what we want to do, and go do it. And I think that is, I've seen diaries and journals before, but nothing as extensive as that. And I think that's a great idea for people who want to publish hex crawls in the future. If you send out a player's guide that has, and it's not necessarily about making characters like, WotC has their player's guides for their different stories or settings. I think that's really awesome. I think that there is a small group of people who in their DIY stuff are pushing, like Michael Evans at Hubris is mostly a ton of random tables that help you decide how you would want to make your own hex crawl. Those are very helpful. I think our podcast is helping a lot of people, especially OSR curious people. You have kind of an idea of what it is, but there's never been a good book that you could read that would tell you how to make a hex crawl sandbox, right? Is that enough?
No, that's perfect. Yeah. And as someone who's trying to publish a hex crawl, I would, if somebody out there who's listening knows of a good resource, do let me know.
Well, I would look at Welsh Piper, Rob Conley. Those guys both have some blogs that a lot of people say. I always forget it, the West Marches guy. He has done a ton of stuff. The Alexandrian has a lot of great stuff. McGrogan. There's tons of really awesome blogs out there. That's where the OSR really started, was blogs, right? So if you can still find some of those old ones, Trollish Delver is a great one.
Okay.
I am
Friends of the
sorry,
OSR. No, sorry. Go ahead.
my computer decided to crash or die on me right now, so I apologize to the audience and to everyone.
Oh, I'm just glad you're back.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So Maria, as a player who's starting to get some experience with the OSR, what kind of things are you looking for out of the scene?
Out of the scene? I'm not sure. It's just I'm just interested to see how different, like, I'm not sure how to explain it. It's just I just want to see the weird modules. I want to see the uh, concepts that the OSR wants to like is all about, really.
Okay.
So
Cool. I think that's probably where I've maybe heard the most about some of this stuff is modules and people running them in Dungeon World, or people running them with Black Hack, or people running them with some various different systems to see if they work. And of course, they always do.
Well, like, I mean, one of your questions is here, you know, when you talk about what is the dichotomy between them. I've actually just talked about this on a couple podcasts, so it's pretty fresh in my mind. I think that they just have different ways of getting to the same place. Really, that's the difference. I mean, OSR is going to be, you know, players cautiously moving around and doing stuff. In the end, we're all just telling interactive stories with each other, you know, and I don't think anyone should be telling the story by themselves. So when you say, is the GM a god? No, he's just another guy trying to have fun, or girl, or whatever, just trying to have fun, like everybody else there. You know, it's a social activity, and let's not make it less fun for anybody else, right? That's I think the biggest thing that you can do. And I think gamers feel the same way. So I guess that I went on another tangent. So
that's a very poetic note to almost end on. Let's grab the chat here and see what people are saying. Maybe we can solicit some questions here.
I think there's some on the Discord that he didn't actually send us. Someone dropped a whole bunch of OSR terms.
Oh, that's some beautiful stuff here that we didn't know we needed to be looking at. Wow. I mean, just some of them are just interesting comments.
I can't see them because my computer's restarting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let's
Here's
see
one.
if I can find the gems.
Here's one from Yoshi. Are you ready?
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing, monster trap detail you've encountered or added to a dungeon?
Oh, that's a good one.
What about you, Marie? You've got any awesome ones that you've encountered, or things that you've seen or done?
Well, this is more something that I made myself for something for an indie hack game, actually, and I'm rather proud of it. It's spiders with human faces, but you can peel the faces off and it reveals blank metal thing.
Thank you for that.
I just think that I'm just really proud of that.
Oh, I sometimes have to X-card spider stuff, like if it gets
I am sorry.
too much, but that is awesome. No, I would deal with that. For that level, I would deal with that. Cool. Thing, monster trap, or detail?
You got anything, Slade?
I mean, it's probably the crab man meat that makes you invisible and causes you massive desire to continue to eat it. And he's the only crab man. There are none left. It just ruins your life.
Wow.
There's some cool stuff in the Into the Odd, the little intro adventure that comes in the book. And there's just things like you're down underground in this big coral structure, and then there's just a big section of coral that's clear. You can see out into the ocean, and all you really see is a bunch of dead fish bobbing around and some kind of like lamprey-like things sticking to the glass. Just an eerie thing like that. Not that specifically, although that is very good, but something eerie like that, where you're just looking out into dim water and everything's dead and you're not really sure why. I really like those types of things, eerie things. Oh, did we lose Maria?
I don't know. Yeah, It looks like it.
Uh-oh.
Dang it.
So Jason, what is your favorite thing, trap, monster, detail?
I don't know how to go with. I don't know if I should be egotistical and put something that I added to a dungeon, or if I should go with something else that someone else did. You know, it's hard for me to always decide. In the excavation of the Tomb of Lornanane, which is an adventure that we put in the first zine, there's this room where some apprentices to this wizard, you know, it was their quarters, but this magical entropy or artifact that exists in the basement, you know, sent waves over and kind of created undead out of a lot of the people. So instead of finding multiple ones, you only find one apprentice, and he's now the zombie that had eaten the other ones. And so when he moves around, you can see the faces and like the arms kick out once in a while. I thought that was a pretty interesting imagery for a game. And most people, when I say that, have been pretty excited about it. Yeah. And that's weird and gross idea. So,
and it's very OSR. Like you arrive in the room and there's one troll. There used to be three, but they're the bones of the other two because this guy was the biggest. You know, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I really like those kind of almost the ecosystem of the dungeon. Like,
yeah, that's what I was talking about when I called it Gygaxian naturalism. That's what the OSR calls it, I guess, when they're trying to do some stuff. Oh. Cool. It makes sense out of weirdness in a dungeon. So go ahead, Slade.
Right. It looks like we're out of time, so it's time to wrap it up. Any last thoughts, Jason?
I kind of got on the Gauntlet Con on a whim. I think I was actually drunk when I signed up to run my game because I had forgotten that I had done it until I started getting emails later. But I really appreciate them deciding that I should be on this panel. I'd never been on one before, and I'd like to thank the Gauntlet people for that. So thank you. And thanks to all the guys who are actually watching and listening. It would be hard for me to do this in the middle of the day, but I appreciate you guys doing it.
Great. Maria, some parting words?
Just thank you to the Gauntlet, and thank you to all our watchers. And yeah, basically the same thing as Jason, minus the drunken sign up games.
Stone cold sober when you sign up for games. Yeah, it's tough to manage that kind of thing. Cool. Great. Thank you. Yeah, I want to say thank you to the Gauntlet for hosting this. I thought this was a really educational experience, and it's always nice to see the experts debate the finer points, but it's also really nice to have the experts maybe bring us up to speed. So I really appreciate Jason coming and Maria for being quite open to all the questions and learning stuff alongside me. Yeah, I want to thank everyone that organized Gauntlet Con. I know it's a heck of a lot of work, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to be running some games later, and it sounds like they're all going to be really fun. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for asking those great questions in the comments, guys. And yeah, that's me signing off.